away.
Sorry.
Great. Thank you all for joining us today, the last couple of days of our Book Fringe, to hear about Fugitive Feminism from Akwugo Emejulu, published by one of Lighthouse's favourites, Silver Press. This book examines the legacy of key black voices in feminism, as well as the tenaciousness of othering in humanity. Her book ultimately serves as a radical manifesto for black women to determine the nature of their own liberation, calling for a new model of action. We're excited to hear about her ideas behind fugitive feminism and how fleeing can often be freeing. This book examines the legacy of key black voices in feminism, as well as... I just read that. I'm so sorry. Akwugo is a professor of sociology at the University of Warwick. Her research interests include the political sociology of race, gender, and the grassroots activism of women in colour in Europe and America. Her work has appeared in Politics and Gender, Race and Class, and the Journal of Ethnic and Racial Studies. Before entering academia, Akwugo's worked as a community organiser, a participatory action researcher, and as a trade union organiser in America and Britain. So today we're going to chat for about half an hour and then have about 30 minutes for questions from all of you. So please keep questions in mind as we're talking, because we will come to you afterwards. I think we're going to start with a little reading from the book and then just have a chat around the book. So let's give a big round of applause.
So thank you guys very much for coming. This is really exciting to do you work? Like, you're here in the middle of the day. Like, I'm so happy. I can ask myself that question. Should I be working? Anyway, so thank you so much for, so you're like, oh, well, it's going to feel like work. Let me, no. So thank you so much for coming. And I also just want to thank so much the Lighthouse staff. They've been amazing. This is the best bookshop. Thank God you survived COVID. What would I do without you? So just thank you all so much for all your support over the years. It's great. So I'm going to just briefly read the preface of my book. And then I've strong-armed folks into asking me questions rather than me talking at you, because I don't like that. I want more of an interaction. So this is a little kind of impromptu, so I hope that's okay with you guys. So the preface is entitled, Lifting My Face to the Sun. I first read No Humans Involved, an open letter to my colleagues by Jamaican writer and theorist Sylvia Wynter in the late 2000s. Since then, I haven't been able to stop thinking about her main proposition, that the human is an exclusive and excluding category bounded by whiteness, and that the ability to receive care and solidarity is limited only to those identified and recognized as human. Wynter asks us to consider who is included in this humanity and the implication for all of our lives. The 1992 Los Angeles rebellion began hours after 4 white police officers were acquitted of charges of excessive force for beating Rodney King, a black motorist. In her 1994 essay, Wynter asks how the city of Los Angeles, its politicians, police force, and its judicial system came to the acronym NHI, No Humans Involved, to classify any encounter with unemployed black men living in the ghetto. And I quote Wynter here. Quote, how did they come to conceive of what it means to be both human and North American in the kinds of terms, i.e. to be white, of Euro-American culture and descent, middle class, college educated and suburban, within whose logic the jobless and usually school dropout, push-out category of young black males can be perceived and therefore behaved towards only as the lack of the human, the conceptual other, to be North American. Wynter's question clarifies what I've always known but never dared to articulate. In asking how the public officials of Los Angeles came to conceive of a particular vision of the human, Wynter lays bare the issue that arises when one attempts to see black people as human by their logic. The problem that we must confront and live through is that black people are not human, and what's more, there's an impossibility for us to be human. Within the construction of the human has come to define and dominate the modern world, unemployed young black men and all black people are not human. We are only the lack of the human. Anyone looking honestly at those to whom violence, poverty, misery, and death are routinely visited can only conclude that Wynter's argument is correct. For her part, Winter understood that universality is limited in how it defines humanity, especially the ways the state wields its power to enact anti-blackness, from police violence to health inequalities. Certain groups of people have not merely been dehumanized, but were never considered human in the first place. This is a first-order classification problem. This first-order classification problem can never be reconciled because our contemporary world is built on this fundamental, enduring binary of human-other. This Manichaean construction is structured around a tension that requires the simultaneous inclusion and exclusion of Black people to produce the humanity of whiteness and manufacture whiteness as humanity. As I will discuss further, various gestures toward expanding the category of the human, not least liberal humanism, which focuses on developing a flourishing, critical, autonomous individual, do little to resolve the problems of exclusion that Winter identifies. Even these seemingly expansive accounts of what a human can and should be are implicitly white and male, since the fundamental classification assumptions, human-other, have not been disrupted and transformed. Likewise, the liberal, rights-based, and hegemonic feminist project of Europe and North America treats women as implicitly white too. The challenge posed by Winter's thought is to consider whether and how the human can be remade. Personally, I do not believe it is possible to reclaim the human, but I wonder, can a speculative Black feminist politics of the human orient us towards different kinds of social relations? Winter's analysis fundamentally challenges Black feminist politics and political history. What is the point of being political and doing politics in a system that cannot and will not see you as human? Why vote? Why engage with institutions? Why be an activist? Why be involved in the world? And what about our political identities? If being human is a category reserved for the few, that means how we organize our lives is also thrown into doubt. Being a man, a woman, a child, Black, Latinx, Asian, or refusing all of these categories completely is refracted through the essential excluding classification of the human. How do we speak of and to ourselves? How do we build individual and collective identities to make real the lasting change on a societal, even paradigmatic level? These are not abstract philosophical musings. I promise you they're not. My research into activist women of color in Europe and America who organize and mobilize to advance their interests keeps circling back to these fundamental questions. Since the 2008 economic crisis, I've been mapping the successes and failures of women of color activists across 15 countries, taking women to include cis and trans women as well as non-binary femmes, and defining women of color as those who experience the effects of processes of racialization, class, and gender dominations, as well as other sources of inequalities, particularly hierarchies of legal status. They are united across time, borders, language, race, ethnicity, sexuality, disability, and religion by the shared experience that, try as they might, they cannot sustain coalitions with their revolutionary white comrades, in particular white women, because these comrades cannot see or treat women of color as authentic partners in the struggle for a new world. As part of our ongoing research into the emotional politics of women of color activists, my colleague Leah Bassel and I recently wrote about the politics of exhaustion, how women of color activists are not just buckling under the weight of austerity measures and an emboldened far right, but they are also facing racist exclusions in their activist spaces when they work with white feminists. As one activist in Copenhagen said of the radical white women in her activist group, I quote her, quote, "It is not allyship. It's a sort of paternalistic relationship with us where they want to control what we do." Winter understood the activist predicament as their trying and failing to occupy the category of human, or more specifically, failing to be recognized by their white counterparts as active and knowing political subjects. In order to reclaim the human, Winter argues that we must investigate how the human is theorized and practiced as an enclosure. From the colonial encounter to the invention of race, to the theft of land and peoples under imperialism, the human was conceptualized and practiced as the power relation of whiteness. Thus, to reclaim the human, she argues, we must divest it from the concept of whiteness, the murderous idea of universal man and its attendant dominations. However, here I depart from Winter, not because I disagree with her, but rather in this strange little book. It is a strange little book, I'm not going to lie to you. I want to consider what we do once we know and face the truth that Black women, the group in which I'm particularly interested, obviously, cannot be human. This book asks if human cannot and should not be, what if human cannot and should not be reclaimed? These questions are my starting point and why this book has been so challenging to write. I do not usually write so speculatively, nor do I typically tackle questions like this. As a political sociologist, I'm on sure footing when I gather and analyze empirical data and prompt and support others to tell me their stories, experiences, their successes, and their failures. So, How might we divest from the human? How might we organize our community building to remake the world outside and against the human? How do we practice care in ways that fundamentally transform our social relations? Winter is not unique in her analysis of the excluding category of the human. James Baldwin, Frantz Fanon, George Yancey, Saidiya Hartman, Hortense Spillers, Fred Moten, Ronaldo Walcott, Christina Sharp, who has an excellent new book out at the moment, Alexander Wihili, Alexander Pauline Gumbs, Marquise Bay, and Frank Wilderson all imagine and examine our lives against and beyond the human. I am neither a Black studies scholar nor a proponent of Afro-pessimism, so I want to tread carefully and respectfully in my forays into fugitivity. My concern is less to do with theorizing Blackness and the human. Instead, I wish to explore what happens when we take for granted Winter's understanding of the human and combine it with the all-too-human politics to create a different way of thinking about and doing Black feminism. 1.5 pages left. This is Fugitive Feminism, a wild proposition, a paradoxical experiment to see whether it is possible to embrace the fugitive's porous, shifting, and unstable identity for a Black feminist politics of liberation. What it would look like to generate relations of care and solidarity with those others outside the category of the human. For instance, what gets exposed about the inhumanity of Europe's borders when we consider placing the interests and needs of the fugitive, the migrant, the refugee, at the center of our caring and solidaristic politics? How might this connect with direct action for radical social change? Experiments, even thought experiments, do not always succeed, but there is something deeply therapeutic about the process. When I moved to Scotland in 2002, I missed the sun in the Texas heat. I was just back for like 3 weeks, I just got back last week, and it's like 40 degrees. So this bit is, you can tell I hadn't been home for a while. I was writing this during lockdown. I was like, it's 40 degrees. Oh my God. Anyway, I can't cope with it anymore. It is, I think it's like 59 degrees or something now. I mean, here, as in Fahrenheit, you see I'm switching. It's like 15 degrees here. I'm like, feels like home. Anyway, so. But when I moved to Scotland in 2002, I missed the sun in the Texas heat. Not anymore. I'm never more depressed and homesick than during a cold and rainy Scottish summer. But I've learned to appreciate the sun when it appears. On those rare occasions when I can bask in the Scottish sun, very rare, everything seems better when I lift my face to it. Dazzled by photons, I step outside of myself and think of other worlds and possibilities, if only for a brief moment. That's essentially what this book is about. Grappling with such issues, I step outside of myself and imagine another way of being alive and being political, alone and together. Thanks.
That's great.
That's the longest I've read. I normally insist on not reading for that long, but it's your thing.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I guess my first question, kind of building on that preface about the human and the non-human, you speak a little bit about in the first chapter about kind of first violences that can make you realize that non-humanity, and you talk a little bit about your own upbringing and your own feminism in the book as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about what shaped you as a feminist initially, and what were those first starting points to, maybe without the vocabulary, to make these sort of distinctions and understandings?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I think a lot of Black feminists, I kind of didn't think of myself, I don't know if I would necessarily in my younger years have called myself a feminist, because that wasn't anything that related to me. Because, so this idea that we tell about second wave feminism in both America and Britain is that women were going, losing their minds in the suburbs, right? Because they weren't in the workforce, and they were and Betty Friedan said, it's the problem that has no name. And it was the coming together of women to realize that they're political subjects. And it's what? What do you even say? My mom and my grandmother always worked. We lived in the suburbs, but they always worked. So this idea that they were isolated was not part of the narrative. The idea that they weren't part of a community. My grandmother and mother were part of the civil rights movement and did organizing and activism. So that was not a story that made sense to me. And that kind of speaks to a broader problem of the alienation from the social sciences, because the social sciences are about analyzing an implicitly white world, where you kind of go, that's not really the experience of me, the people I know and love, and you just kind of have to accept that, right? And you kind of go, well, I guess I'll just kind of find a place. And I think it wasn't until, I think a lot of Black feminists have this revelation if they go to university. I think the first time I read any Black feminist text was at university. I think my 3rd year at university, so 4 years in the US. And I remember my first degree is in political science, and throughout that entire time obviously we hadn't read any Black people. And we had only read 2 women, so it's Simone de Beauvoir and then, what's her name? The Rights to Have, Hannah Arendt, of course. And I was like, ugh. And then I was like, this doesn't seem right. There's something not quite right here. And I saw that there was like a Black feminist literature class. And what was so amazing about it was that we read effectively the Black feminist canon from the turn of the 20th century up until, by that time, I'm super old, so it was like the mid-90s, which is so, can I just say, by the way, it's so weird to see people wearing things that I was wearing when I was 18. It's just like, it's just a very weird, anyway, but that's neither here nor there. I was like, I remember that, oh. Anyway, so, and alongside reading like these kind of key texts, their eyes were watching God, when the rainbow's not enough, we read everything. We read kind of key fiction texts alongside theorists. And so when we were reading Ntozake Shange, we were reading bell hooks. And so when we were reading Gloria Petrie, we were also reading, Angela Davis at the same time. And that was, I have to admit, it was hard to go back to political science after that. I was like, these motherfuckers. Like, I was so mad. I was like, wait, this was here the whole time? And no one told me. And then also it's like, I'm like having to kind of like struggle with like Aristotle, which is perfectly fine. But I was like, there seems to be, we have to kind of accept his idea of the human when he's going around saying that like all women are fundamentally not human. They don't have souls because we menstruate and so are too emotional. We have to just kind of accept that as like, oh yes, human flourishing. It's a very weird thing. So this is how I came to it, was encountering it first at university and then through kind of community organizing and activism, where people are organizing as specifically as Black women for their communities, but then also trying and failing to build coalitions and solidarity with other interested groups.
Great, thank you so much.
Sorry, that was
that's so interesting, especially the kind of myth of loneliness that gets spelled as the root of second wave feminism, kind of a lonely hysteria, when there's actually plenty of community to be found. And maybe literature is where that's been expressed the most, rather than in non-fiction. Speaking of reading and books, who informed your thinking on the topics in this book specifically? I know you listed a few that agreed with the Winters argument that you outlined, and who else should we be reading? And I would encourage to maybe mention things that aren't as readily available as often these things aren't. Things can be out of print, but who, in a broad sense, has informed the ideas in this book?
Yeah, the book has been a long time coming, and so I kind of rattled off a couple of kind of key names. So we're kind of in a classic moment of Black radical theory, mostly in the United States, I will say. So some of this stuff doesn't translate well to the European context, which I think is actually genuinely important. But, so as I say, Christina Sharp has a new book out, and her second book, In the Wake, is really interesting and important. Hortense Spiller's, her kind of classic article called Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. Is that right? I don't know. So you're putting me on the spot in terms of, the titles are wrong, but the names are all correct. I think are really, you can Google it. Oh, that's terrible. I hate doing that to people. Anyway, I think were essential to me. Of course, Saadia Hartman is the key person with this, and if you haven't read her newest book, I think is really important. And they're also, but I think it's not. This is implicit in quite a lot of other work as well, which I think is important. So George Yancey is a Black philosopher who's based in the United States, who I think is really important. He has a new book out as well. And there are a couple of other folks, if you kind of go back, especially I think on the continental tradition. So Frantz Fanon, you can never go wrong with a little bit of Frantz Fanon. I think is absolutely essential to understanding so much of this. So like this mix of European and American scholars and activists just trying to find their space and trying to understand a different problem that has no name, that can't be named.
Great.
Yeah.
I also wanted to pick up on another little section that you mentioned in the preface, which was about organising and activism specifically, and the non-humanness, if I can phrase it that way, that black women, women of colour more broadly, probably feel in these spaces. That is where community should lie, but often can be just as exclusionary, or sometimes feel more exclusionary in their irony compared to other spaces. As being a bookshop that champions social activism and organising, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about those spaces, particularly regarding the ideas in your book.
Yeah, so my friend and colleague Leah Bassel and I, we actually have a new article out. It's open access, you can read it. Sorry, I'm trying to plug this. It's called The Lonely Activist, and it's important for a number of different reasons, because it speaks to this contradiction, this paradox that happens in activist spaces. Because as I was saying, I've been working on women of color's activism in Europe, so looking specifically at activism against austerity measures, against the far right, and for migrants' rights. So for 15 years, since the 2008 crisis, and I've had like 3 iterations of like comparative international projects, looking at how women of color organize and mobilize in their interests. And what is surprising, because it's now been like a million years since 2008, can I just broadly just pause and say, when I'm working with my students and I talk about the 2008 economic crisis, they're like, what? And it's actually very upsetting. Like, I mean, we knew this was going to happen, but it's like, oh, hello. So it was actually very upsetting to see that people have now, like, this is now the world that people live in. So the thing that we predicted would happen, that you just expect that nothing works, that you expect the NHS to be on its knees, you expect not to get any help from the state. Like, it's just very interesting. Like we said at the time, austerity is going to be terrible because it's going to create a new idea of social citizenship. And now that has come to pass, where you just expect nothing works. And it's very distressing. Anyway, so since 2008, I've been looking at how women of color have been organizing. And I guess what I'm surprised by is looking comparatively and then looking over time how I keep hearing the same thing. So whether you're in Denmark or Germany or Scotland or France or wherever, it's the same issue. That, you know, let's take, for example, you're in an anti-fascist network. And at this moment of an emboldened far right, you literally have fascists in government in some countries, particularly in wonderful gender equality Scandinavia, which they need to get it together. So this is important. You have contemplations of far right coalitions in Germany and in Spain. You have a far right government, of course, in Italy. So this is not a theoretical concern, right? This is like a very real thing that's happening on the streets. And in, say, for example, these anti-fascist networks, you have women of color activists saying, we need to name the problem, specifically about white supremacy. And you have ostensibly radical and revolutionary white comrades go, whoa, hold the phone. Where in the naming of white supremacy, because I don't know how else you can understand these far-right governments, but also the coalitions, but also their politics that have also, by the way, been co-opted by the center-right parties anyway, without an understanding of white supremacy and its particular permutations in the European project. What we see are revolutionary white comrades feel implicated in this process, which is, one would say, why do you feel implicated? Mm-hmm. And in the South, we would say, I'm from Texas, as you know, we'd say only hit dogs holler. So, and you kind of go, why are you so upset by this? Because I kind of think, I don't understand another framework for us to realize what's happening here. Because that's what's so interesting about white supremacy, that it always encompasses all of these other things. That, you know, the anti-trans panic, and boy, Edinburgh, I'm so sorry, you guys are the middle of all this stuff, cannot be understood without outside of a white supremacist framework. The kind of the xenophobic panic about small boats, stop the boats, all that kind of stuff, right? You know, the great replacement theory. You actually have to have a framework to understand that these are not all discrete ideas. This is like literally, when we talk about the global far right, they have a playbook. They do, like, because it's the same politics everywhere, right? It is not a surprise that you see trans folks, migrant groups, all the rest of it monstered in the very same way across countries, right? There's a pattern to this. But to understand the pattern, you need to understand the politics of race and racialization and white supremacy. And the far right understand very clearly and to great success. Yeah. But this reluctance on the left, because of this idea of class, not race, which is, you just can't, but I'm so, it's exhausting.
It is one of the most frustrating things to ever hear in an organizing space.
It is truly bananas, and that's a technical term, by the way. And that generates this loneliness that we're talking about. So you come with this framework of saying, we need an understanding of the way the world is not how we would wish it to be, and that we need strategies and tactics to deal with this. And what you find are women of color activists shut down, undermined, and pushed out of these spaces. And so in the spaces that, and it hurts more because you're like, wait, you're meant to be different. This is supposed to be different, right? Because you don't expect that kind of support maybe in a university lecture hall or like with your family, but you know, this is an intentional community that's being built, and you find people being undermined. And so. Yeah,
I mean, thinking about the idea of a fugitive, these places often feel like a refuge for a lot of people initially, and then it hurts more when they're turned into another place of violence. We're coming to the end of my questions, so I hope you have some questions.
Yeah. Give it to me.
But I did want to ask you kind of, what do we gain and what do we lose through this idea of fugitivity? It's a hard word to say. Fugitivity. Yes, not so much a pros and cons list, but like, what is to be gained through the adapting of this concept and this nature?
No, that's a good question. I mean, I think we gain a more clear-sighted idea of the nature of the world. That I feel like so many things fall into place once you realize, oh, this wasn't ever for me. Oh, I see. And that's actually genuinely very sad, but it also kind of frees you quite a lot from saying, why, you know, for example, I always, in the book I talk about this, it's like, Hannah Arendt, so important, the only woman many of these like, politics professors will ever read. And then you're like, oh, the right to have rights, oh, so important, Eichmann in Jerusalem, oh. And then you're like, oh no, she wrote a book about opposing the civil rights movement? What? And you're like, oh, when she's talking about the legacy of the Holocaust, she's also instituting anti-blackness simultaneously. What? That's some wild stuff, right? But it also makes you think, oh, well, then what does the nature of freedom mean in this context? What does equality mean? And it helps you go back to basics, right? Yeah. Which I think is actually very important if we're serious about liberation, that you can't take for granted these ideas, particularly within the branch of like liberal humanism, which is, we're like across from like, the stupid David Hume Tower and stuff. Get out of here with this, right? And like I think it's one of those things where you have to take that seriously, and David Hume was the worst of all this. He wasn't talking about any of us. Like, unless you're out here as a landowner, he's not worried about you. So like, I mean, and that's like very important to understand, that the foundational concepts of the Enlightenment were for the merchant class who were buying and selling humans. And in fact, me and the other Black people in here, we were the capital. And once you understand that, things kind of start to fall into place. And also, why would you want to hold on to these kinds of ideas, right? Because contained within them is a murderous enterprise, quite literally. And so then the question is, why wouldn't we want something more and better for ourselves? And so that's but of course there's great peril, right? Because it's like our whole world is organized around this idea of the human. So who are we without that? But isn't that what's fun about it? To try to understand, well, who might we be without this concept? Yeah,
that's great. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Do we have any questions to start?
We have like 15 minutes, right?
I can keep asking questions if there isn't one, but
No, let them stew for a bit.
Would you like to stew for a bit?
Yeah,
Okay.
Let them cook. Right. Okay.
What else did I want to ask? Kind of covered that. Okay. I am actually a little bit more interested in the Enlightenment period and how that has shaped some of the ideas in this book, or unshaped them maybe. And yeah, like you already talked about who they were for and stuff, but in the context of today, what are the like base ideas that were crafted in that movement that seem really hard to resist now, that have become almost natural in their thinking? The idea of the human, but what goes along with that? Does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, look, the entire contemporary European project, the EU, is like in its founding documents, because it's like, God, I spent the summer like reading like the charter for the coal and steel community. That's how much of a jerk I am. So, and all the rest, I hadn't read it for decades, and I went back to read it again and stuff. And it's the very similar idea that harkened back to the 17th and 18th century, right? About rebuilding after the devastation of the Second World War means that we have to reaffirm an idea of equality, and we have to reaffirm an idea of freedom, but also the free movement of people and goods across borders, which is very interesting. So that fusing of capitalism to freedom and equality is really interesting and important. That was always part of the Enlightenment, because it's like, if you read Locke, it's actually very important to actually read the canon, because once you understand that, like, that dude had like I'm so disrespectful. I love it.
No, I like calling Locke that dude.
He had like a property interest in like Virginia. And so he's writing about securing his property interest. Yeah. You're like, oh my God. I was like a political theorist person. And no one ever talked about that, right? And then you kind of go, oh, well, it all kind of makes sense. This on property stuff. It's like, oh, they really meant it. Like, it's not a metaphor. He's like, I'm trying to get paid. And so that's why the crown can't take my money, he can't.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
He needs it to be a fundamental right.
Right. That you can't, interfere with neither God or the king can interfere. I'm getting all steamed up because I'm all excited. So that's amazing to understand, right? So under those conditions, when you realize that a lot of your theorists, that we're all like, oh, Your Highness, all this kind of stuff, we're just trying to secure their own economic position at the expense of like Black and brown people across the globe. You're like, well, what is this freedom? What? Yeah. What does this mean? And so we're kind of deluding ourselves and thinking that like this is some sort of precious idea, because they themselves were quite the sharks, right? Yeah. And so we're thinking of this, these hallowed ideas. Get out of here with this, right?
And that, I guess that fusing of freedom to capitalism as one becomes this like central myth of the 20th century in all its conflict. Something I did also want to talk about was you speak about Fanny Eaton in the book, a figure that I'm also very interested in. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about her for anyone who doesn't know.
Well, let me just very, very, I promise not to get on. Let me see if I can find this thing on Fanny Eaton, because she's quite the interesting character, I think. Yeah. Okay, 83.
So it's a deep dive everyone should do.
Right. So just very briefly, so I'll just give a quick sketch, because better than just talking off the top of my head. So this is called, this is an interlude. So in the book, there's like, some heavy theorizing, but then there's some poetry, there's some like...
It's a fun time.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wouldn't say fun, but that's probably too far. But it's interesting, stimulating. So anyway, Fanny Eaton was born in Jamaica in 1835. Eaton traveled to London as a child in the 1840s, although little is known of her early life, nor the period after which she is most famous, working as an artist model, a pre-Raphaelite muse. Eaton, for me, encapsulates the essence of Black British feminism, absent presence. Like many people on the margin, she embodied what Audre Lorde referred to as a litany for survival. And so Fanny Eaton, if you see the Black model who is in all of the pre-Raphaelite's paintings, so Lucy What's-Her-Chops with the long red hair and stuff, there's a Black model who's often in many of these works. That's Fanny Eaton. And so I'm fascinated by her because
Yeah.
I'll never forget, I think my first time in London going to the National Gallery or somewhere, and I'm like, who is this black woman in like these paintings? What
Yeah.
is her life?
She
What
has a
did
monopoly on all the
Yeah.
gigs.
Yeah, absolutely. So like in the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and Sisterhood, the less well-known Sisterhood, she's this key model. And so she's working at the height of the Victorian period, the height of, I'm fascinated
Yeah.
to know what is her life. And we don't know anything about her. We know only about like her, we only know her as an image quite literally captured through the white gaze. And that is fascinating. Isn't that fascinating? And it gives like these tantalizing insights into her life. We don't know. She died on the Isle of Wight. She lived until like her, I can't remember, like her 60s or 70s, so a relatively long life, 10 kids. But we don't know anything about
The
her.
Isle of Wight, really? I didn't know.
Yeah, somewhere a while. I was like, what are you doing there? What? So every step of this, how and why did she come from Jamaica to, but remember, she's a crown subject, right? And so how and why did she travel?
Yeah.
What was it about her that captured the eye of these revolutionaries in modern English, not British painting? And what was her life like?
Yeah.
Was she a supermodel? Was she the Naomi Campbell of her day? Who can say?
Maybe.
But that tells us something important, I think, about, how people are doing this like blind casting in these stupid period dramas, like Bridgerton and stuff. Sorry, I refuse to watch it. I was like, this
I
is
haven't
not
seen it either.
no one asked for it anyway.
Every other South Asian has told me you have to watch it, and I refuse.
No, don't do it. Don't do it. It's
refuse.
ridiculous. Because it's like, that's not, oh really? Okay.
I'm not watching it.
People seem to love, anyway, but you just, how did we get, okay, I knew one of these asides would catch up with me and then I lose my train of thought. But anyway, I'll get back there. But I just wonder, this says so much about Black British history, that this important model that tells us, that upends our ideas of what beauty is, about how we think about aesthetics, all of these kinds of things. We don't know anything about her. And she, for me, speaks to this really, I don't know, the peril of fugitivity, right? That's like, she has fled and she was kind of free, perhaps, maybe. I would have thought working as an artist model, you're not like a millionaire, but you're also not scrubbing floors and stuff, right? So that provides a kind of freedom for women at that time, right? I'd love to know more about her, but she's effectively erased from history even as we look at her, even as we gaze upon her. We don't, she's an empty vessel in a way, which I find fascinating. And that says a lot about, I think, Black British feminism, because it gets overwhelmed by the American cousin, and often and is not seen as interesting and sexy as, like, especially what's happening in France at the moment and even in Germany.
Yeah.
And so I think it speaks a lot about the precarity of Black British feminism.
Amazing.
So.
Any questions? Got one at the back there. I'll start with that one.
I'm walking off the street, so if it doesn't make, I'm just curious.
So thank you for coming.
I'm interested in that. Obviously, you mentioned like the first, like the kind of the humanness, the idea of the person, and I'm just curious with various like feminist movements and a lack of homogeneity, both in terms of like thought and ideas and like culture and like personal histories. Do you feel like there's enough of a collective notion of what would take over if we got rid of the idea of the person, or do you, and in order to facilitate paradigm shift, basically?
Right. So for the benefit of the live stream, I've been told I have to repeat your question, and so I'm not going to do that. But what I will do is say that effectively the question is, well, what would replace the human? Is there enough of a collective idea of what that would be? So my answer is, and I hope this will be deeply unsatisfying, is who can say? So spoken like the true academic, I'm just asking questions. So
Discourse.
it's just, it's all for the discourse. No, but seriously, it's also, this is not meant to be necessarily a universalist project, because I think we lose something by replacing one kind of excluding universal idea with another, right? And so in the book, I talk about how part of the process, at least starting the process, is about saying, how can interested folks who were once human and wish to make that leap into fugitivity, how might they band together and kind of collectively think together. I think that takes us quite far down the road of the coming together. Because I think now, especially as we all kind of still recover from lockdown and all the rest of it, we now understand the importance of community and the collective and what it means to think, write, speak, eat, dance together. And that, I think, will help us think through some of these other issues. So I've left it intentionally open because it's like I genuinely don't know, and I don't want to be prescriptive in this and like imposing these ideas on others. It's more about saying, well, here's a possibility. What might we do with it? And so I know it's deeply unsatisfying, but that's the point. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I was wondering if you have maybe any observations in terms of the different discourse that is happening in feminism, particularly in Europe, because we have, for example, very diverse racially Britain. But I'm coming from Poland, which is mostly white. So there's like different systems of oppressions that are basically colliding. So in the same time, you can see in the Britain probably what you have seen in United States in terms of systemic discrimination, and in the same time we have also the different basically shades of whiteness. So where me as a Eastern European, I'm coming from to Belgium, and I hear Poland, our cleaning lady is coming from Poland.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you anything you found interesting in that in terms of like you moving from United States.
Yeah, so I mean, to be clear, I'm American. I've lived in Britain for like 20 years, but all of my work is based in Europe and in a comparative perspective. So, but I don't work on Poland particularly. What's very interesting, it's nice that you said this different shades of white. We talk about hierarchies of whiteness, and on the continent, oftentimes what we see is a reluctance for particularly East Europeans to engage in these kinds of coalitional politics. And so I was in Berlin for 6 months last year doing some work, and I was struck by, so this is like the aftermath of that wave of refugees from Ukraine who came. And what I was really surprised by was how a lot of the already existing women-led migrants groups, who are mostly composed of African women, who were like at the train station, at the Hauptbahnhof, there greeting people off the train, helping people out, all the rest of it. But then because the German government was about opening, like flinging the doors open in terms of like residency visas, free German classes, help with accommodation, free access to university, and free access to the labor market for Ukrainians, we saw them dissipate. And so they were helped, but then didn't come back to help. And what we see, and of course, is a large Polish diaspora in Germany, as of course you know, who are nowhere to be seen in these spaces and this is a constant problem, because whilst no one is arguing that there isn't a hierarchy of whiteness, and I would love for there to be a real conversation, and there's some things starting, which is very interesting. Apparently, in Ukraine, like the Kombi River Collective statement has been translated for the first time, and there's something really interesting kind of percolating. But I am surprised by the lack of willingness to understand that how precarious whiteness is, and as soon as you move from east to west, you are no longer white, or you're white-ish. But then that is never understood as a process of racialization and a moment of potential solidarity work. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but this has not been something that is consistent.
As a follow-up question, if I could,
sure.
Do you see any potential for example, the race theory to be applied to the spaces? Because you said like people are saying it's class, not it's not a class, not race. So probably in those spaces that we are talking about, it's even more of a kind of motivation to say that it's class, not race, because we don't see those different shades of white. So how would you maybe if you had to talk about race in this context, maybe apply this theory here, if you understand what I'm saying? Because not sure myself now.
No, it's fine. So for the folks at home, the question was, well, is it possible to apply theories of race and racialization to different categories of whiteness? And it's like, yep, that's a whole cottage industry. Like there are folks, I personally don't do that. I'm not really interested in that, but there are people who do that, but not me. And it's like, and yes, that needs to happen. And particularly in an Eastern European context, some application of understanding kind of colonial history, because there's a refusal to understand these ideas because we're like, well, we were not colonizers, we were the colonized, and so there's like a refusal to engage on a fundamental level, and there seems to be like some weird, like oppression Olympics happening, I will say, it's which is unhelpful. Right? I will just say this, and it actually becomes a barrier to understanding. I won't say more because of the live stream, but I have a very interesting example of that. So if you want to come talk to me later, but not on the live stream because I think they're watching. So, yeah,
always watching.
They're always watching. So
That's great.
thank you.
I think we're gonna leave it there, just because I think we're out of time. But I will say that Fugitive Feminism and Black Feminism in Europe are both available to buy.
Buy the book.
We also have a few copies of Left Cultures.
Oh.
You have a essay in, I believe.
Yes. Oh, that's a book of interviews by.
It's very good.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah.
So we've got a couple of
I
copies
haven't
of
seen
that. Okay, well, we'll
Okay,
show it to
so-
you.
anyway.
And we're going to head into the room next door so you can carry on chatting and maybe do a little signing of these books, just so we can get this room back together. But let's give a big round of applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yay. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
No,
That
thank
was
you.
great.
That was amazing. Thank you. And I'm sorry for like.
No. It was so interesting. I really enjoyed it.
No, that's a format I much prefer. So like honestly, I appreciate it.